There is much to be said, and it's obvious, about the Calvinist capricious and arbitrary God. I mean, it's rather capricious and arbitrary, obviously, because they have no reason for why God does things. They're God. But they insist on it being that way. They insist on it being that way. Look at it. Because of sovereign, the false premise of sovereign. Sovereign is all-controlling, and sovereign is doing stuff for no reason. No known reason. When they can try to apply a reason, they will. But they'll say, God created some men for hell, and some men to be nice to, though all men were in the same state, deserving hell. And so they have no explanation for why God plucks some out of the line. But they will say, it's not because man's good or evil. It's not because of any works they've done. When you go, what is it for? Well, we don't know. His own counsel he will keep. Who has known the mind of God? Obviously not a Calvinist, going by the doctrines. But, I mean, I could say, hey, Mr. Calvinist, you don't even know God. They go, yes, I do. Really? Why don't you tell me why he does things? Well, we don't know. Well, okay then, you don't know God, you idiot. They have no explanation why some men are saved and others are not. You see, because it can't be because of whether they're good or bad, because according to them, everybody deserves hell. But they will say things like this. Well, you see, he shows some men, and I'm not going to use their phrases, but he used some men to be really nice to, and he's used other men, to show how just he is by punishing the crap out of them forever. And you go, but why? Why this guy, not the other guy? Well, we don't know. So in other words, there's no legal reason or law that they can attach to. You see, there's no way that they can depict their God as good. That's why they use the word sovereign. And so they have no explanation. Of course, they put Jacob he loved, Esau he hated, and they always put that in terms of salvation or predestination. Of course, they lie about the context because that's what they do. Maybe they bowl on the weekends, but their day job is lying about God and the scriptures in context. Jacob and Esau in terms of birthright. They make everything about double predestination. Even Jacob and Esau. They have no explanation for why one guy and not the other. His own counsel he will keep. You have anybody to know what it is. Maybe it's because he don't look so good. If he actually told you the reason why he does things. How are they going to disprove that? How are they going to argue back? No, he is good. Really? Well, you're going to have faith that he is. Maybe someday he'll tell us why he picked this guy and not the other. And so therefore they can't actually perceive his goodness. They can't even point it out. They don't even bother talking about God being good. They just talk about him being sovereign. And their definition of sovereign is not as it's found in the dictionary of a person with the sane mind. They have God creating man, and men are depraved, can do no good, and are not even allowed to want to do good, which causes a little bit of a problem with Paul. Just a little one. For the good I want to do, I do not, and the good I do not want to do, I wind up doing. It's not me. It's the principle of sin in the flesh. But you see, they're in a conundrum with Paul there because they can't extricate themselves, because they can't suggest that it's Paul after he's saved, because then they'd say the spiritual life is a complete failure and Paul is still enslaved to the flesh. Deliverance of the flesh is not by definition still being enslaved to it. But if they go by what Paul's saying, for the very good I want to do I do not, and the very thing I don't want to do I wind up doing, it's not me, it's sin in the flesh, therefore you have free will, the unsaved man, wanting to be good, not being able to do it, doing what he does not want to do, and he says it's not I, and so therefore I'm not accountable. They don't want to do that. It's a little late in the game for the Calvinists to start telling the truth. And so they don't have an explanation. It isn't credible or believable for Paul to say, for the very thing I want to do after I was saved, I don't do. And the very thing I don't want to do, I wind up doing after I'm saved. So guess what they do? They don't talk about Paul in that context at all. That's what they do. Don't talk about him at all. The only time Calvinists will talk about certain sections, and like the one where for that which I want to do, I do not do, and the very thing I don't want to do, I wind up doing, they'll only talk about that when you force them to. But even in that case, when they do, they bear false witness, lie about the context, and come across as like mental patients. Because once again, how can one be saved who says, for that which I want to do, I do not do, and the very thing I don't want to do, I wind up doing? That's called a failure of the spiritual life. And you see, it isn't exactly commensurate with their tulips doctrine and the perseverance of the saints. But the saints shall persevere in good works. Really? Well then, suppose Paul says this, for that which I wanted to do, which was persevere in good works, I do not. And the very thing that I don't want to do, which is not persevere in good works, I wind up doing. And so guess what? I'm going to hell. You see, they have no explanation for that. That's why they don't talk about it. And that's why they don't talk about God in terms of goodness. Because when you're talking about goodness, you get into principles of goodness. And it gets connected with man's everyday knowledge of good and evil. So there are degrees of unlawfulness, portraying God as unlawful. There are degrees of false reports. Like, some beliefs are so way out there, they're not deceptions. They're just idiot collectors. I mean, hey, you can find people for all kinds of things, You can have a man who's a cross-dresser who looks like I don't know what, a longshoreman. And you throw a dress on him, and he looks like a longshoreman with a dress on. And he'll go, ain't I sexy? And I would say, maybe on Mars, but you is ugly as hell. Not only are you ugly as hell as a woman, you're ugly as hell as a man. So there are people, who want to live in the completely unreal. You'll have that. And so you have people who believe doctrines and false religions, false Christianity, that are not believable to anybody who is seeking that which is good. But there are beliefs, by the way, that are designed specifically to deceive those who are seeking good and who want to mean well. You see? And guess what? They talk about the unlimited atonement and, and Calvinism, God holding his standard over the depraved, which is ridiculous. God expects the depraved to be righteous without his own son and without him. You see, that's the standard that God holds over their head because they sin. What? Like he expected them to be righteous? You see how ridiculous that is? See, if I would ask somebody, do you think man could be righteous? Even men with free will, Do you think man can be righteous without God and without Christ? They'll say, no, of course, that's ridiculous. You ought to be slapped for even saying that. What's interesting is, every time they do that, their version of God doesn't live up to the standard of righteousness at all, and their God's standards actually are not the standard of righteousness. And so the Calvinist has the depraved standing at the final review judgment, and he's angry at them because of the depraved. Duh. You see where they have a perfect excuse. Well, I was depraved. You created me that way because you wanted me to be that way, you idiot. And they'll go, how dare you call God an idiot? What the hell's the difference? I'm going to hell anyways. Why should one worry about calling God an idiot? He's going to cook you anyways, so who cares? They have a perfect legal argument. Well, let me see. You created me depraved, and you created me so that I couldn't even desire not to be depraved. And you're shocked that I'm depraved. You're an idiot. And you see, God would be an idiot. And the Calvinist God is an idiot, by the way. And so you see how he's without legal basis for condemning them, when really he's the one who's responsible. I don't think it's a good thing, to create somebody depraved and to create them so that they can't even desire not to be depraved. And also to create them without a solution and to not lift a finger to help them because you don't want to help them because you want them to be depraved because you want to go through the pretense of having somebody to yell at. When it's you who should be yelled at because you created those conditions, you Calvinist idiot God. But guess what? It's easy to beat up on the Calvinists. So now it's time to deal with another false doctrine, where the God of this false doctrine that I'm going to talk about is just as much an idiot as the Calvinists, or just as unlawful. And it's the God of the penal substitute, of the unlimited atonement, where Jesus Christ died in every man's place, and every man deserved that death. And so God punished his own son, pretended it was you, and so then he pretended that justice was satisfied, and so you get totally off scot-free, and you never suffer the wrath of God for anything that you ever do. That's the standard practice that nobody in human history has ever punished for any of the willful crimes that they ever do. And the penal substitute of the unlimited atonement God is just as much an idiot as the Calvinist God, but it's hidden a little better. They make a little more refined arguments. Their false premises are designed to deceive those who want to mean well, and those who want to seek the truth, and those who refuse to give up the idea or the notion that God is good. So you have a different deception for a different type of person. And this is where you have the penal substitute of the unlimited atonement variety. And that's why you'll hear them say, all men deserve that death that Christ died, infinite wrath, all that stuff. They go through the false premises like this. Well, you see, the debt to justice is so great that we can't possibly pay it, so naturally an innocent guy should die. Isn't that perfect? And somebody who was actually of the penal substitute persuasion, the unlimited atonement type dude, if he were in the room when I was speaking these things, he would probably say, I don't like it here, goodbye. I'm just saying. You ask about infants. Well, they're condemned in Adam. What the hell does that mean? What are infants responsible for? What do they do? They go, oh, well, you know, they're born sinful. Well, I don't recall them doing that. Why don't you quit bearing false witness? It's like, when I ask them a question, it's like they didn't hear my question and they heard a completely different one. I didn't ask how are infants born. I asked what are they responsible for. It's funny. They start bearing false witness right away by pretending to be answering questions that weren't even asked. I'm like, excuse me, are you talking to somebody else? Because I didn't ask the question that would result in that answer being given from you. Guess what? The penal substitute, unlimited atonement, Christ died in every man's place, every man deserved that death, and all that stuff. Who put you in that body? It wasn't your mama and your daddy. Who put you in that body of sin and death? If they're going to have the unlimited atonement, you see, grace, grace, God have wrath on you for being in a sinful body, being forced to obey the corrupt nature, Him having wrath on you for that? Well, you didn't choose to be in that body. Guess who put you there? According to them, that is. And actually, really, according to me. Man is created and is born, and he's in a sinful body. I'll tell you right now, God did it. Guess what? It's not a crime. And it's not a punishable crime either. Now, you might say man is in an unlawful state, but that's not through the doings of God. You can thank the Genesis 6 corruption of all flesh. And so, the unlimited atonement. What about the infant who lives 2 months and dies? Did he deserve to be nailed to a tree? Now, before you react in horror about nailing infants to trees, that ain't the worst part, is it? You know, the infinite wrath, the soul-melting wrath. It's funny. Here you have God being infinitely severe for something that is not man's fault. Doesn't that remind you of the Calvinist God? Being infinitely severe on the reprobate, when it was not their fault. Though the reprobate, of course, don't really exist, but for argument's sake, hypothetically, if men were created to be reprobate, because God wanted them to be that way, so that he could then pretend like it's their faults, that's a pretense, bearing false witness. What of the unlimited atonement variety? Man being born sinful. Whose fault is that? They pretend like it's man's fault, and it isn't. But then they're engaging in liberal rationalizations, like, well, you see, Adam was the federal head. That's a doctrine they made up completely out of the heart of Satan. And you see, Adam was a representative of mankind. Really? Why don't you give me scripture and verse for that? Well, they don't have one. And so then they'll pick one and interpret it in there. But God, having wrath on man for being born sinful and being a slave to sin, even with free will, the man who says, for that which I want to do, I do not, and that which I do not want to do, I wind up doing. They have God having wrath on him. That's not man's fault. And I will say, once again, that is not a case for wrath on man. And, like I say many times, Before you were born or created, you didn't go down to the body store and they go, we have all kinds of bodies here. We got righteous ones and unrighteous ones. I'll take the sinful one. Okay, you got it, buddy. Well, I could understand that, holding man accountable for the body he chose, but man didn't. And we can't engage in rationalizations like, well, man chose the body through Adam. No, he didn't. And Adam doesn't represent me. He doesn't. Adam can only represent himself. Man has to give account for himself. That's who man has to give account for, each individual. And no wonder God says, I will repay, recompense, deed for deed, whether good or for bad. Well, it didn't say, I shall recompense on everybody the deed of Adam. Here you have the God of the unlimited atonement, having wrath on man for things that is not man's fault, or responsibility, or of man's choosing. And that is just as capricious and arbitrary, though it's packaged a little more in a little more refined way. So, the God of the unlimited atonement, who's completely nuts, doesn't appear quite as nuts as the Calvinist God, though he actually is.